Okay, let's turn to Genesis chapter 16 now. And I've asked you to read it all the way up through chapter 20 for this morning. Whether we'll be able to cover those 5 chapters through chapter 20 this morning remains to be seen. We did something unprecedented yesterday, and that is that we covered 3 chapters. Unprecedented this year, that is. I've done it before. But we're going to try to even cover more today, but without sacrificing any of the major considerations that God would have us to dwell upon and pause to reflect upon in the material. Now, we found in chapter 12 that God called Abram out of his homeland to come to the land of Canaan. When he arrived there, he said that he would give the land to him and his descendants. Then we found that Abram went into Egypt due to a famine in Canaan, and there he compromised his integrity, claiming that Sarai, his wife, was actually only his sister. This almost got him into trouble. It did, in fact, result in some embarrassment, and he left Egypt somewhat richer because the Pharaoh had enriched him, but also in some sense having lost something of credibility and of respect in Egypt. Well, then in chapter 13, we found that God so orchestrated circumstances that Lot and Abram could no longer dwell together peaceably, so that they had to part company. And there was danger, in fact, of a serious rift in their relationship, but Abram wisely laid aside and yielded his rights to the younger man and allowed that Lot would take his choice of property. And we know that what Lot chose was totally chosen on a selfish basis. He did not consider that Abram had more right to the land than he, and he took for himself the better portion. That is, materially speaking, from the eye of the flesh, it was a better portion. However, we are told in that chapter that the portion he took was near the land of, or the city of Sodom, which was inhabited by men of exceeding wickedness. And then, after this parting of ways between Lot and Abram, God came to Abram and promised that nonetheless Abram would possess the whole land eventually. In chapter 14, we find that Abram, for the first time, becomes a blessing to a Gentile nation, and that happens to be Sodom and Gomorrah. And that is because Chedorlaomer, a heathen king who had kept those cities under tribute for 12 years, came to quench a rebellion that they staged in the 13th year. And he took many captives and spoils from that plunder, and Lot was among the captives. Abram mobilized his servants and went after them and liberated the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah so that they returned to their own land again. This, I said, was, I believe, a warning from God to those cities that they ought to repent or else experience even greater judgment in the future. They did not take the warning. Immediately after that, Abram met with Melchizedek and had an experience there that is not, the significance of which is not designated in Genesis, but is brought out later in the New Testament. This was apparently a meeting with Jesus himself, or that person, that divine person that later came to be revealed in Jesus during Jesus' lifetime on earth. This was, I believe, a theophany, an appearance of Christ prior to his incarnation, meeting with Abram. In chapter 15, having turned down the riches that the king of Sodom offered to Abram, Abram was reassured by God that he would not be the loser for this in any sense, but rather that God would be his reward. Abram complained, well, I have no son. What good will a reward be to me? Essentially is what he was saying. If I'm going to die, I'm an old man and I have no son to leave my anything to. Excuse me. And that, on that occasion, perhaps I should say for the first time clearly, God made it plain that Abram's heir would be a child out of his own body. Now, God had already told him he'd become the father of a great nation, but that did not necessarily mean a biological father. He had a servant named Eliezer in his household, who was set up to be his heir, and technically speaking, he could have formally adopted Eliezer and left everything to him, and left an estate in his name that way, but God here in chapter 15 promised that his heir would be biological, would come out of his own bowels, as the King James English puts it. And Abram said, well, how shall I know that? And God made a covenant by having Abram part the pieces of different animals, and he saw a smoking furnace and a burning lamp pass between them. On that same occasion, God took Abram out under the stars and said, if you can tell the stars or number them or possibly decipher them is another possible translation, so shall your seed be. And after that it says, quite significantly in Genesis 15:6, Abram believed in the Lord. And that means his believing, was imputed to him for righteousness. That means it was credited to him. It's as if you were counted to be something you are not, something better than what you really are. It's as though you are a criminal and you're walking up to the judge's bench and he says, well, I count you to be not a criminal. I count you to be an innocent man. That's what imputation of righteousness suggests. And Abram was imputed righteousness, or he was justified, declared righteous by his faith. And that became, of course, the forerunner of all the saved in the New Testament era, and probably we should say in the Old Testament also. Faith appears even in the Old Testament to have been the means of salvation. That should serve as a corrective to what many Christians think, because I know that many Christians have the impression that people were saved in the Old Testament by keeping the law, and that it was different in the New Testament. Justification was by faith in the New Testament. The fact of the matter is, Paul clearly states that the law never justified anyone. It didn't have the power to do so, and it was not intended that it would do so. The law brought the knowledge of sin, which is a necessary precursor to salvation. You have to know you're a sinner before you'll repent. And therefore the law served the purpose of being a schoolmaster to teach us our need for salvation, to show us our sin. And Paul said twice that by the law is the knowledge of sin. The law was never given as a means of salvation, even before the law was given. In the days of Abram, it was established by precedent that righteousness would be counted to a man on the basis of his faith, as in the case of Abram. And in Hebrews chapter 11, which you probably know, gives a long list of heroes from the Old Testament, it says very plainly that these all received a good report through faith. And the heroes mentioned begin with Abel, and include Enoch and Noah and Abram and Isaac and Jacob, and then it goes on to Moses and David and the prophets and the judges are all included there. And it says these all received a good report through faith. So we understand that to mean that these Old Testament characters received their status before God by faith, just as Abram did, so that salvation has always been by faith. It's never been by any other means. It's never been by the law. And the law was a temporary, parenthetical provision that God made at a certain point in history in order to illustrate, two reasons he gave it, I believe, the Bible indicates, to demonstrate to people their own sinfulness and need for grace, and also, of course, in a limited sense, to keep society under control. The law, Paul said in Galatians 3, was given because of transgressions until the seed should come, meaning Christ. Now, what he means by that appears to be that there needed to be some government, there needed to be some law to keep society from destroying itself and just going into anarchy. And so the law of God provided that, a source of preservation of a godly race, but not a means of eternal salvation. All right, now we come to chapter 16. All Abram has been told about his seed at this point is that there will be numerous offspring, as numerous as the stars of heaven, and that it will be a biological child of his that will bring these promises to fulfillment. He has not yet been told who the mother will be. Now we know from the way the story develops that the mother was intended to be Sarai, Abram's wife. In those days, however, such things were not assumed as generally as now. We live in a strictly monogamous society where a man only has one wife legitimately. But in those days in the Middle East, and especially before the law of Moses, but actually this didn't change after the law of Moses either, in the Middle East it was assumed that a man could bear children by a number of women who were perhaps wives and concubines. And Abram did not have a law like the law of Moses, and he certainly didn't have the enlightenment of the New Testament to give him his views on this subject. He was a product of his culture in many respects. The only way in which he differed from others of his culture were in those few things that God had revealed to him specially. And those revelations seem to have been few and far between. They were significant revelations and very life-changing revelations, but not necessarily comprehensive in terms of giving Abram a total understanding of the ways of God. And so it shouldn't be too shocking when we find that Abram acquiesces to his wife's suggestion that he go in unto her maid to bear a child by her maid Hagar. Sarai, remember, was his wife, but she was about this time 65 years old or more. And she had always been barren. She was very probably past menopause, which would make it physically impossible for her to conceive. But even if she were not beyond that point, she had never been capable of conceiving anyway. So she was recognizedly barren. And since there needed to be a biological heir to Abram, the wheels were turning in probably his mind as well as hers, but she was the one who initiated this plan. She had a maid, a slave, named Hagar, who was of Egyptian extraction. And in those days, a slave had no rights, had no status, and in a sense didn't even have its own name, although we find Hagar called by that name, Hagar, but legally speaking, a slave took on its master's name and was totally the possession and property of its master. And it was fairly common, it is now known, in those days for people of the Middle East who were barren, who could not bear children, to give a substitute, a concubine, a maid, or someone like this to the husband, that he could go and sleep with her, and she could conceive, and then the child of that conception would be born upon the knees of the lawful wife, as signifying sort of an adoption that takes place. That it's really the maid is having children for the wife. She's sort of like a pinch hitter in a baseball game. She's really just, the whole thing is not a sexual, it doesn't have sexual connotations, although sex is clearly involved. It's clearly a childbearing pragmatic arrangement. And we find this taking place also in the marriages of Jacob, because Rachel, his beloved wife, was barren, and so she gave Jacob her handmaid to do the exact same thing here that Sarai suggested. And then Leah, who is in competition with Rachel in that story, said, well, if Rachel's going to take the lead in this matter, I'm going to give him my maid too. So it ended up that Abram not only had two wives, but two concubines who probably were, strictly speaking, just childbearing machines in his eyes. I'm not saying that he didn't have sexual attraction to them. We don't know whether he did or not. But whether he did or not was certainly not the issue. It was not a matter of lechery on his part, but a matter of practical fulfilling of what he considered needed to be done in having a child. And God had not at this point told him specifically that Sarai would be the mother. Therefore, when Sarai came to Abram in chapter 16 and suggested, why don't you go into my handmaid and have a child, the thing appealed to Abram. It seemed good to him. And no doubt in his mind he thought, well, maybe that is the way God wants to bring this to pass. Now, even though God had not said specifically that Sarai would be the mother of the promised seed, it should have been understood. Well, I don't know if we should say it should have been understood, but I think it would be fairly obvious that God was going to work a miracle in the situation, and that Sarai needed to have faith just like Abram did in order to do it. In fact, when she finally did conceive later, we read of it in Hebrews chapter 11, by faith Sarah received strength to conceive seed and became the mother of Israel, that is, of the people of Israel. Now, she had to have faith too. But at this point, her faith was somewhat less than Abram's, and his wasn't exactly all that strong, or maybe we should just say he didn't have that much light. At any rate, they did something that, as we look back at the issue of it later, it does not seem to have been right. It certainly was not what God had in mind. Whether we can call it a sin on their part is hard to say, because they weren't given specific instructions to the contrary, but at the same time we see that the fruit of it was bad, as we shall see. So Abram went into Hagar. It says in verse 3, and Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he would have been 85, because he came there at age 75, and she at this time was 75. Okay, I said 65 before, but she's 75. So she's past middle age at this time. And she's a senior citizen. She'd get a discount in most of the restaurants around here. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. Now this means that Hagar, when she found herself pregnant, thought herself superior to Sarai. Now this is not uncommon at all. Because women's understanding of their role and their identity in that society was simply that they were there to bear children. They were there to perpetuate their husband's identity and family line, and a woman who was unable to do so was a reproach to society and a shame to her husband. And as soon as Hagar saw that she was now bearing children for Abraham, and Sarai was not, she took it as an occasion to think herself superior to her mistress. And mistress simply means female master. So she despised or lightly esteemed Sarah, and she got a bit uppity. Even though she was a slave girl, she started thinking of herself as superior. Now, it does not give specific details as how this contempt for Sarai was exhibited in the home, but we can imagine at least that Hagar ceased to think of herself or behave as a servant. She despised the authority of Sarai, which would suggest in practical terms that as Sarai would give her orders and give her duties to perform as formerly, Hagar would simply disregard them. She would disregard Sarai's authority, and she would rebel. And Sarai said to Abram, "My wrong be upon thee." In other words, this is your fault. You were the one who slept with her. "I have given my maid into thy bosom, and when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee." Now, Abram is not seen as a strong leader in the home necessarily, although he is said to be one who would teach his children to walk in the ways of God. And yet, here he kind of disowns any responsibility of the situation. He says, "Abram said to Sarai, Behold, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee." And so when Sarai dealt hardly with Hagar, she fled from her face. So she drove Hagar away by ill treatment. Now, we have to admit, Hagar brought some of this upon her, but it doesn't seem like Sarai was very right in what was going on either. It seems like everyone here was wrong. Abram could have stepped in as the head of the household and sought to bring peace in the situation. Earl?
Oh, yeah, I think there's something that was skipped over. He mentioned an example of someone else who had two wives, and they had handmaids, and the handmaids bore for their wives. So the man had two wives and two handmaids. And Abraham, I think a lot of people think this, and I think we skipped over this. It seems like he had a wife and a handmaid, and the wife's handmaid. But actually in verse 3 it says that, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. Abram also had two wives, and I think there's a little bit more significance in the next couple verses or so, because the time when Abraham was in Egypt, that's where Hagar came from Egypt, and she was aware of that thing which he did, which I don't judge Abraham for. I think he was being wise as a serpent, harmless as a dove. That's my viewpoint. But Hagar was able to see Abraham looking at Sarai as his sister. So when it says she was despised in her eyes, that I think that she was looking at Sarah as Abraham's sister. And when it says that Abraham gave her into her bosom, to have authority over again, well, in those cultures, the older wife has authority over the younger wives. Usually, that's the way it works out. So I think it was reestablishing that situation, and I think that we can overlook that the intricacies of the relationship, that Hagar actually was a wife and Sarah actually was Abraham's half sister.
Okay, well, what we should realize too is that concubines were sometimes called wives, even though they were still in the status of slaves. And the fact that Hagar remained at the status of a slave is brought out by Paul's commentary in Galatians 4 on this subject, where he points out that Abraham had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. One was born by a slave and was born a slave, and the other was born of a free woman and was born a free child. And so even though Hagar is called a wife, that's a concession that is made usually to concubines. There were wives of different ranks, and a concubine was a wife of a lower rank, it's true. But she was still a slave girl. And, now, however she may have justified her approach to Sarah, we don't know. We're not told how she justified it. It appears, just from the narrative, that she felt superior because she was able to bear children and Sarai wasn't. But at any rate...
Okay, and one more thing.
If it's brief, we need to carry on.
Relations, what you mentioned is a parallel between Hagar and the child and Sarah and the two covenants, the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And since Hagar represents the Old Covenant, and the Old Covenant does have a parenthetical legitimacy, as you brought out, and I think that Hagar in that relationship has a parallel parenthetical legitimacy also.
Well, that's a possibility. Christians commonly say that it was not the will of God for Ishmael to be born, suggesting, of course, that this situation with Hagar and Abram was sin and that it was just a bad thing. That, of course, suggests that the Arabs who descended from Hagar are all, out of the will of God just by existing, And I'm not sure that our Arab Christian friends would agree with that, since their names were written in the Lamb's Book of Life before the foundation of the world. I think we can see that God can make the wrath of man to praise Him, and that He can work all things together after the counsel of His own will. God will use many things, and we could say because He used them, they seem to have a legitimacy. But that's not necessarily always the case. Just because God uses something does not make it necessarily legitimate, and we can't, we certainly would not wish to say that our Arab brethren were not in the will of God in being born, because obviously it was in the purpose of God that since Abram was going to do this, and since there would be offspring, that some of those offspring would become Christians just like those of other families. Certainly there are many children who would be termed illegitimate, if we could use that term, although that's not a really very fair term to use of those children. But children who were born as a result of sin, yet who became Christians. And, what do do? We have to say, well, it was God's will for them to be born, but maybe not necessarily through the means, of sin. Could have brought it about more legitimately if the people involved had been more obedient. At any rate, not to cast any kind of stigma upon Abram for this, because, as I said, he was not violating any clear revelation that he'd been given verbally from God, as far as we know. Without stigmatizing him for it, we can nonetheless say the fruit of it was not exactly good. And it's very clear that the child that was born from this relationship later had to be driven from the home by the will of God. And so it brought much heartache to Abram. It brought much division in the family, and it has ever since brought a lot of hostility between the two races that have come from Abram's two sons.
Possibly the point was that he was trying to fulfill God's promises in his own efforts.
That is the point, I think. And I think that's what Galatians chapter 4 brings out, that Ishmael was a child of the flesh. Isaac, by contrast, was a child according to promise. Instead of allowing the promise of God to be fulfilled by supernatural interposition from God, Abram did take matters into his own hands and did that which required no miraculous intervention. That is, by a typical, ordinary, conventional stratagem, which involved no miracle necessarily, because presumably Abram was still able to bear children naturally at this point, and Hagar was not old or barren. Therefore, it was just a matter of a product of a fleshly plan, a fleshly stratagem. And whether we call it sin is another issue. But to call it of the flesh, we have no doubt that is exactly what it was. It was, strictly speaking, it wasn't led by the Holy Spirit. It was not in response or direct obedience to a command of God. And it basically created problems later. And Paul later speaks of this in Galatians 4 as something that was a child of the flesh. So while we don't wish to cast any negative stigma upon the race of people that came from Ishmael, nonetheless, we can say that this whole event was something that was where Abram went ahead of God. And because God's promise did not seem to be happening in the time that Abram felt it should be happening and coming to fulfillment, he decided to speed things up a bit. Now, he'd been there 10 years, and we can hardly blame him. Listen, God 10 years ago had brought him into this land and said, I'm going to give you this land, I'm also going to give you a lot of kids. Now, 10 years has passed, and he's no closer to having any children than before. And 10 years, as we're reading through the Bible story, it's just a matter of a few verses of 10 years, and it doesn't seem that long. But if you really live through those 10 years, and nothing's happening, 10 years, a lot of you haven't even been Christians for 10 years. And imagine how long that would seem to be if God called you to a ministry, and your ministry was to have a child. That was Abram's whole ministry. Do you know, Abram did nothing of great significance as far as the ministry except to have a child. That was his whole calling and his whole ministry, to have a seed through whom all the nations would be blessed. So his ministry, his call to ministry was have a child. Well, 10 years after he started following God in faith, he's not an inch closer to having a child, as near as he can tell. And it's like his ministry hasn't come to fruition. And so he kind of, by the flesh, initiates a ministry. You know, that's really what happens here. And we will find, I believe, and I'm sure that I won't be the first person who's made this suggestion to you because it's a commonly recognized principle, that what Abram did was he started a ministry in the flesh, an Ishmael. And whereas God did call him to a ministry, but God was preparing him by long waiting and stretching of his faith and so forth to trust God to bring about a supernatural birthing of the ministry. But because he had the vision for the ministry, but not the patience to wait for God to establish it, he brought into being what turned out to be really a counterfeit ministry. And I say counterfeit simply for this reason. He mistakenly thought that Ishmael was his ministry for 13 years. It was 13 years between the time that Ishmael was born and the time that Isaac was born. And until God announced finally when Ishmael was 12 years old, God announced to Abram, Ishmael's not the one. Until that time, Abram spent 12 years in that ministry that he had birthed, raising this son, thinking this was it. This is the ministry that God's given me. And then God says, I'm not in it. That's not the ministry. And there's so many parallels to that in modern times where people really have a vision from God for a certain kind of ministry and they rush forward to bring it to pass in the efforts of the flesh. And there seems to be a certain manner of success in it. There's a certain degree of ability to keep it going, to pump it up by your fleshly efforts and to just keep it afloat. And when finances are low, send out a newsletter and by coercion and psychological devices and phony appeals and so forth to bring in enough money to keep the thing afloat and to make the thing really seem like it may be of God. And to actually continue in this year after year after year thinking, I'm doing the work of God. But then for God to come to the man after 12 years and say, listen, all this stuff you've been doing, that wasn't it. Yeah, I gave you a vision for the ministry, and it's something like this, but that wasn't it. This one came about through your efforts, it's been sustained by your fleshly efforts, and it's not me at all. And I want you to scrap that and start all over. This is a principle that we will encounter many times in the Scriptures, sometimes referred to or generally referred to as the death of a vision. And some of you may have heard that expression. I could give countless examples from the Scripture and from more contemporary Christian lives. From Scripture we could see it both here and also in Abram's having to offer up Isaac. Also with Moses slaying the Egyptian 40 years before he was really called to deliver the people of Israel. Certainly even the death of Jesus represented the death of a vision to the disciples. What this means is God gives a man a genuine vision for some kind of ministry. And so he begins to see a fulfillment of that. Perhaps it's birthed in the flesh. And he begins to see a fulfillment of that ministry. And he really thinks it's happening. And at a certain point, it dies. The thing just kind of crumbles. And God smites it. And the man has to totally die to it until the point where he feels like, the ministry's over with. It's gone. It's dead. And that's how the disciples felt when Jesus was in the grave. That's how Abram felt when he was ready to throw the knife into Isaac. That's how Moses felt after he slew the Egyptian, thinking he was entering into his ministry of delivering the people of Israel, but then was exiled for 40 years and tended sheep on the backside of the desert. And by the time God finally did call him to the true ministry, he says, who, me? No way. I'm not qualified. Joseph's another excellent example because he had this vision of his brothers bowing down to him. And he had two dreams concerning that in his early life. And then what happened before that ever occurred, his brothers betrayed him and sent him into slavery. He spent years in prison. It seemed like his vision was totally dead. But what happened? In all the cases we've mentioned, there was a resurrection of the vision supernaturally. You see, sometimes the vision would appear to begin to be fulfilled, but then God smites it. And suddenly the man who has the vision suddenly thinks, wow, what's going on? He's thrown into total confusion and despair. And he thinks, wow, I guess maybe the vision wasn't of God or something. Remember the men on the road to Emmaus saying, we had hoped that this Jesus would be the one, but I guess not, It's like maybe our vision was totally faulty. What went wrong? But then, through a divine intervention, God resurrects the thing. In modern times, I can think of a number of cases like this, and I don't want to belabor the point, but Rees Howells, when he first began to pray for the sick, he had a vision of being a man who prayed for the sick and saw them healed. And so he began to pray for the sick, and the first person he prayed for seemed to recover, and then had a relapse and died. And Rees Howells was complaining to the Lord, says, what's going on? I thought you told me I'm going to have a ministry of healing the sick. What's going on here? And God said, the first fruits are mine. And he says, I don't want you to feel like this is your ministry or that you have the power to make it happen. I'm taking the first fruits of it, but then later, God raised him up so that when he prayed for people, they were always getting healed, and God resurrected it, but he had to kind of die to his vision initially. YWAM, some 20 years ago or so, had a ministry for a ship that would go throughout the world carrying supplies and missionaries, a mercy ministry to various nations that had special needs. And they began to negotiate the purchase of a ship, I believe in New Zealand. And they had this great vision for this ship ministry, and they played it up in all their mailings and all their newsletter and everything like that, and contributions were coming in, and it seemed to be really of the Lord. And something happened, and I've heard it many times, so I forget the details, but somehow the whole thing fell through. Either contributions didn't come in or something, and they just kind of forfeited the whole thing. It became almost a scandal. It became a real shame to them, a real reproach to their ministry. And they began to scratch their heads and say, "What's going on, Lord?" And then later, just actually a few years ago, less than 10 years ago, the Lord resurrected that vision and gave them a ship out of the blue, and they named it the Anastasis, which means resurrection, because it represents a resurrection of their vision. They had the death of a vision, then they experienced the resurrection of a vision. Without being too pointed and personal, I might even say about our ministry here. And Bruce knew me back then. In 1978, I had a vision for a ministry very much like what we're doing here. I wanted to run a school, a printing operation to print tracts, and a ministry that had outreach to all the churches of a local area. And I moved a group of 12 people from California to Albany, Oregon, into a house, and we began to implement that vision, and it seemed to work for a while. We were having a good rapport with the churches. We didn't have a school established yet or a printing ministry, but the first point was the rapport with churches. All of our people were going to different churches. The pastors were coming and teaching in our house, and we were teaching in their churches. There was a good relationship happening. And then just out of the blue, 2 months after it got started, it just kind of fell apart. And that's a long story of how that happened, but it just fell apart, and I was just left in confusion, saying, "What's going on, Lord?" And so I just kind of threw in the towel and moved back to California, and I've spent about a year and a half, casting about for, where's my ministry supposed to be? What am I supposed to be doing? And eventually the Lord resurrected my personal ministry in Santa Cruz, and then when I'd totally forgotten about this whole vision for a community and a school in Oregon and everything like that, it was totally far from my mind. The Lord brought this piece of property to us. He offered it to us for free. And then a group of people in California says, "We want to go with you and start this thing." And it was a supernatural thing. We weren't even planning to do it. And then it was kind of laid in our lap, and we came up here, and as you can see, it hasn't died yet. In fact, it still seems to be growing, and it's growing without a lot of, publicity drives or anything like that. I really believe it's the Lord. I believe it's a vision that, to which I had to die, and then it was resurrected. And every one of you are likely to have, if you're in contact with the Lord, you're going to have a vision for your lives. God's going to say, "Here's my call on your life. You are going to be this. You're going to do this or accomplish this. This is why I've created you. This is why I've called you to become a Christian, so that this could be accomplished through you." And it's very likely, once you have identified that vision and that calling, that there will something happen by divine providence, not by your doing or anyone else's, but just by divine providence, where you will come to the place where you think that vision is impossible to fulfill. It'll just seem like it's totally died, and you have to die to it. And it may be that before that time you'll actually birth an Ishmael. You'll actually establish something in the flesh along the lines of what you feel called to do. And that makes it all the harder when God smites it and says it's not it. And you have to totally die to it and start from ground floor again. But when God resurrects it, you see, it's a work of God and not a work of the flesh. And when it's a work of God, it doesn't have to be pumped up by fleshly efforts. You don't need a lot of fundraising drives and publicity drives and so forth. I believe in publicity, and when we can afford it, we'll probably have some. But I don't believe there's anything wrong with, publishing things, and letting people know that you're there and so forth. But you know what I'm talking about when you see some of these ministries are just always sending out these appeals for money and these phony things where the guy says, "I had a vision. I was on an airplane. I had a vision of you and me, and you made a $4 million contribution and so forth, and turns out it's a computerized letter that went out to 1 million people, and it's just phony fundraising gimmicks. That fleshly way of pumping something up shows you that it's an Ishmael. It's something that's birthed in the flesh, and it's seeking to be maintained in the flesh. Whereas something that's of God doesn't need that kind of stuff, because God births it and sustains it. Yeah, Bruce?
Because of the circumstances of my life, our marriage and separation, because we weren't honoring legal marriages and everything, But we went through a thing and the Lord showed me. He really showed me to a lady that lived in a Commonwealth state that my wife and I were legally married. So I figured, well, this is it. This is great. But then 2 weeks later, instead of us getting back together, I figured, well, it's almost time for our anniversary. We'll get back together on our anniversary in about 3 weeks. Well, the day of our anniversary, or actually I got the day after, she sent me this real radical letter, and then a week later she totally cut me off. I wouldn't even let me see the children or even talk to her for almost 2 years. So it was right before that happened, where the Lord seemed to, was where the Lord opened up that vision. That was like the death of the vision. In fact, I really stood on that. Now, after just waiting for 2 years, it seems like the Lord is starting to name me.
Amen. I think that probably many of us could testify to that. Anyone who's been walking with the Lord for a number of years probably has had an experience. It might not be in a marriage, but it might be in some other area where the Lord has really smitten something that they thought was of Him. And maybe it was even. Isaac was of God, and yet God made Abram die to Isaac and made him offer Isaac up upon the altar. So even if something is birth of God, it could be that God will have to kill it and resurrect it. And you know why Abram later, we haven't come to this yet, but when Abram did offer Isaac upon the altar, you know why he did it? Because it says in Hebrews chapter 11, he believed that God, if necessary, would raise him from the dead. He believed that even if this vision died, that God could raise it up again. And that's the faith that we have to have. If God has promised it, then He will make it happen. And if it seems like it comes to a place where it's impossible for it to happen, nothing is impossible with God. What did the sisters of Lazarus say when Jesus arrived after Lazarus' death? They said, "We sent for you before he died. If you'd come then, he wouldn't have died." Now what? What are they suggesting? It's too late now. But it wasn't too late now, you see. Because when your hopes seem to have died, it's never too late. If God has made some kind of a promise to you, you can be sure that He will employ whatever means necessary, and He's got them at His disposal to make it happen what He has promised and to fulfill His vision that He gives you. Well, let's go on here. Perhaps we should avoid interruptions, not that I don't value what you people have to say, but just simply because we're not going to get anywhere if we keep having them. We need to cover some material here. So there was a conflict in the family. Abram did not really take charge in the situation, but handed it back over to his wife to do the confronting, and Sarah didn't have the grace for that, and became abusive. And so Hagar did what most of us would do, and which we would generally feel was justified, and that is she fled. As it turns out, it was not justified in the eyes of God, however. Verse 7 says, "The angel of the Lord found Hagar by the fountain of the water in the wilderness, by the fountain by the way to Shur." That means she was on the way back to Egypt, back home. It's Mama. And he said, "Hagar, Sarai's maid," so he still called her Sarai's maid, that was her identity in God's sight, "whence camest thou? And whither wilt thou go?" And she said, "I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai." And the angel of the Lord said unto her, "Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself unto her hands." And the angel of the Lord said unto her, "I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude." That is true also of the Arabs as well as of the Jews. The promise was made concerning both Isaac and Ishmael. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, "Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael," which means God hears, "because Jehovah has heard your affliction. And he will be a wild man," Ishmael will. Actually, in the Hebrew, it means a wild ass man, a man who's like the wild asses of the hillsides, untamed by other men. "His hand will be against every man," meaning he'll be somewhat of an aggressor, and a warlike Bedouin-type people will come from him. "And every man's hand will be against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren." And she called the name of the Lord that spoke to her there, "Thou God seest me." Actually, El Roy is the name for God she chose in this place, which means God who sees me. El Roy. "For she said, Have I also here looked after him that seeth me? Wherefore the name of that place was called, or of that well was called Beer Lahairoi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old, that's 86, when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abram." Now, Let's talk a little bit about this before we go on. Hagar was fleeing from unjust treatment. Now, she felt no doubt fully justified, as many of us do when we seek to get out from under an oppressive situation. And yet, God did not consider her as justified in flight. When He called her, He said, Sarai's maid, where are you going? You know, where do you think you're going? You're still a maid. You still belong to Sarai. Just because she's abused you doesn't change that relationship. And by the way, Hagar was, I'm sure, very self-justified in her own eyes, but we know from reading the story that she had brought much of the abuse upon herself by her cocky attitude. We sometimes meet women who are, in a sense, fleeing from their husbands. They've separated from their husbands, and when you talk to them, they say, oh, my husband's so abusive and so forth, and they really win your heart over and say, wow, this poor woman, we shouldn't send her back to her husband because he's so abusive and so forth. But when the truth is known, really, most women who are abused are not 100% innocent of the matter. I will say there are some men who are abusive unprovoked. And that's because they're under conviction. Generally speaking, I've known of some women who were very godly women, very submissive to their husbands, and yet their husbands were, because of conviction, abusive, in which case the women served as martyrs in that relationship until the conversion of their husbands. But in many cases, we're talking about men are not doing to their wives what the wives feel they should do, and so the wives feel justified in leaving. Whereas when God would call them, if He was merciful to them as He was with Hagar and actually sending an angel to correct, He would say, He'd still speak of them as the man's wife. And if they would really see the thing objectively, they might see that much of their behavior had instigated or aggravated the problems in their situation. It's interesting that the angel did not side with Hagar in her flight from Sarai, even though Sarai was not being exactly a nice master. We're told in 1 Peter chapter 2, servants, obey your masters in all things, not only the good and the gentle, but also the froward, the King James says, which means the perverse and the cruel. And it says, for if you suffer for well-doing, that's praiseworthy, but if you suffer for doing evil, that's not praiseworthy. In other words, it's a good thing to suffer innocently. Jesus did, and when we do, we enter into His sufferings, and we also can look forward to entering into His glory for it. But it's in 1 Peter 3:18 that specifically says, you servants who have masters who are not generous, not gentle, not good, but who are cruel and abusive, submit to them. And that might seem strange to us because we have this concept of, I'm entitled to my happiness, I'm entitled to my independence and so forth, and I'll submit insofar as it's really fair to me and so forth. But we have to realize that before God, none of us have really any rights that He does not have the right to revoke. In our Declaration of Independence in this country, it says that men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including the right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And we have been taught that from our childhood in this country, that we just have an inalienable right. That is, no one can take it from us. The right to be happy, the right to our life, and the right to be free. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are our rights, endowed by our Creator. Well, I don't want to dispute whether those rights exist in the sense of human relations. I do believe there is a sense in which it is true that I would be wrong to deprive you of your life, or to take you into captivity, or to interfere with your happiness wrongly, in which case it could be said you have a right to those things because I don't have the right to infringe upon them. However, the Creator who bestowed such rights also has the right to repeal them. If He is the author of such rights, He is also in command over them, and He has called many times His servants to lay down such rights. The right to life, how many of His Christian martyrs have had to die for their convictions, when they could have violated God's commands and escaped death? But God called them to lay down their lives. Jesus said, he that seeks to save his life shall lose it, but he that will lose his life for my sake shall find it. It says in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 11, they conquered, they overcame Satan by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto the death. Christians should never feel that they have the right to life or the right to liberty. The Apostle Paul considered himself the prisoner of the Lord. When he was in prison, in the Roman prisons, he called himself the prisoner of the Lord. Why? because it was the will of God for him to be in that state at that time. And he accepted that as the Lord. The Lord was his jailer. And he gave up his liberty for his loyalty to Christ. As far as pursuit of happiness, it's very evident, no matter where you read in the Scriptures, that happiness is not the main objective of the Christian life. It's certainly the main objective of most American people's lives, because we've been told that this is our inalienable right. But clearly the Bible indicates that we are to pursue after holiness, not happiness. Happiness comes as the result of a clean conscience before God. True joy does. But in pursuing happiness, we can't serve two masters. We can't serve God and also be pursuing personal happiness. We have to lay down our rights to be happy and even pursue the way that would, we think, make us unhappy in order to be obedient to God. And we will find in obedience that there is a joy that we could not have found by pursuing happiness as an end in itself. And those things which we consider our rights, we have culturally been conditioned to think that we are justified in escaping from a situation that deprives us of such rights. That is not the case. Biblically speaking, Christians can be called upon to lay down every right they have, and if we lived a life of misery for our entire earthly existence because of this, we are told it would still be worth it, because we have an eternity to be repaid for our goodness, by God. And our right choices will be repaid. We will never be cheated by God, even if we never find happiness in this life. Now, I personally can say that the path of obedience has been, for me, the path of happiness. I would never, when I'm unhappiest, has always been when I haven't been sure whether I'm in the will of God. When I am feeling best is when I know I'm doing what God wants me to do, even at times when that involves a great sacrifice. And I think you would testify the same thing. And so what I'm saying here is that we would, in our hearts, because of our conditioning, justify Hagar. Oh, she's being abused by her mistress. She ought to flee, and more power to her if she can get away. But that's not the way God looked at the situation. She had certain obligations. She was a servant. She couldn't just walk away from that. The providence of God in her life had put her into a status of a servant under Sarai. And she couldn't just disown that status and walk away from it because it wasn't making her happy, or because it wasn't comfortable, or even because it hurt. But in fact, she needed to obey God, and that might even involve giving up her rights to her, liberty and happiness, or even maybe in her life. But in obedience to God, she'd find the fulfillment of her real needs. Now, she was told, nonetheless, even though God did not grant her the right to do what she was doing, yet He did pronounce a blessing. He would be with her. He would especially be with the child that she was carrying, and bless him ultimately to become a great nation also. And we know that this happened. And He told her, you'll name your son Ishmael. Why? It means God hears. Why did He want her to name the child that? Because He was sending her back into a situation where she might get no justice from her human masters. And if she ever desired a hearing for her position in the house of Sarai, she might never find it. But God would hear. She could always appeal her case to God. In the midst of her affliction, she could, because she was in the will of God, because she was right where God told her to be, she could call upon Him and He would hear. And that was to be her consolation. And the very presence of that child in her life was to be a perpetual reminder. Every time she called Him by name, the name means God hears, God hears. And so, how many times a day does a mother call her son by name? Constantly, though she was in a hard situation, God ordained this so that she would be constantly reminding herself, God is not deaf and is not blind to my problems here. He's in charge. In fact, she even came up with a new name for God, that she called Him El Roi, God who sees. God hears and God sees. And therefore, though she was called to be in a situation that was unpleasant from the earthly point of view, she was under the eye of God. The eye of the Lord is upon the righteous, the Bible says. And that's supposed to be consoling, and I think it is. She named the place, which happened to be by a water well, Bir Lahairoi, which means the well of the God who lives and sees me. And Bir, B-E-E-R, is a Hebrew word that means well. And we will find this word many, many times. Beersheba is the well of the oath. Bir Lahairoi is the well of him that liveth and seeth me. This is a Hebrew word we'll encounter many times, because often a place was named after a well. A town would grow up and it would bear the name of the well. because in the desert region, wells were very important, and obviously civilizations would grow up around regular sources of water. And so here we have the first mention of such a thing, a town or a place named Bir Lahai Roy, named after the well. It's between Kadesh and Bered, in case you want to find it. Okay, then she had this child, and it says specifically, Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. Now, in fact, the child was named Ishmael. Whether God sovereignly just put it on Abram's heart to name the child Ishmael, or whether Hagar conveyed to Abram, well, God spoke to me and said his name's going to be Ishmael, and Abram submitted to that, we don't know, but certainly God's word came true to her. Now, when we go to chapter 17, we have a jump of 13 years, because we are told at the end of chapter 16 that Abram was 86 years old. But in the first verse of chapter 17, he's 99 years old. What has happened during these 13 years? Apparently nothing to report. Nothing to write home about. Ishmael has been growing up in the home. Abram has presumably been assuming that this child is the one. After all, it's happened. I've got the seed now, and this is the one. And he had great vision for this child. And now, of course, at age 13, Ishmael was reaching the age that was culturally recognized as maturity. If it were later Jewish society, he would be up for bar mitzvah. He'd become a personal son of the covenant. In the Semitic tribes, at age 12 or 13, a child was considered to take on the responsibilities of a man. And so, of course, this would be a significant year for Abram, because his son, in whom he had so much hopes hung, so much vision, was now of the age that he was actually taking on the rights of a full heir. Here, the seed was to inherit the land, and here's the boy. He's been a child all these years, and Abram has been, zealously, protecting this child and directing the child to be like him and so forth. And now the child is at a place where he's reaching the age of what we call releasing the child to his mature responsibilities. And now this is the time where Abram really expects things to bust loose for Ishmael. And what actually happens is the opposite. This is the year God comes and says, it's not Ishmael. At the very time when the ministry seems to be ready to blossom, is sometimes the time when God takes the axe and cuts it down, puts it to the root of the tree, and hews it out, because it's not a tree that my Father has planted. Jesus said every tree that my Father has not planted will be rooted out, plucked up by the roots. And that seems to be what's happening here, just at the time of fruit bearing, it would seem. Abram was 99 years old. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am Almighty God. This is the first time this name is used, El Shaddai. Almighty God, it's translated in our English version. I am Almighty God, El Shaddai. Walk before me and be thou perfect. Perfect is a hard thing to live up to. Jesus said, be perfect even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Sometimes the force of that statement is lessened by the realization that the word perfect in the original languages can be rendered mature or complete. But I doubt that God was having to tell this 99-year-old man, be mature. Grow up. Here he's 99 years old. He's far more than mature. He's almost too mature. Too mature to have children now. And so in saying be perfect, I doubt if the implication was be mature. There is a sense in which a perfection can be reached in this life, but not such as some people hope to reach. There are two kinds of perfection, two kinds of completeness that are spoken of in the Bible. One is ultimate, in the sense that when Jesus comes and we receive our new bodies and there's no more temptation and so forth, we will not have any sin. We will reach sinless perfection. We will be beyond even the potential for sin at that point. Our nature will have been ultimately transformed at the coming of Christ, and we shall be like Him, for we shall see Him as He is. That is an ultimate kind of perfection to which we all look forward. Paul said about this in Philippians chapter 3, not as though I had already attained, neither were already perfect. But this one thing I do, forgetting the things that are behind and reaching on toward the things which are before, I press on toward the mark of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. He said, I'm not yet perfect. And he's talking about in the ultimate sense. Interestingly, and ironically, 2 or 3 verses later, in the same chapter, Paul says, let those of us who are perfect be thus minded. He obviously uses the word perfect differently there, because he says, I'm not yet perfect, And then 3 verses later, he says, let those of us who are perfect think this way. Now, what's that mean? Obviously, there's another kind of perfection. One that is looked forward to and another kind that we can have right now. And that is a perfect heart before the Lord. A perfectly clean heart. A heart that is devoid of wrong motives. A heart that is totally devoted to the Lord. It is said of David in the Old Testament that he was perfect before the Lord his God, except in that matter with Bathsheba and Uriah. But in other respects, the Bible eulogizes David as a man perfect. Now, he wasn't perfect. He did a lot of things which, when we read his life, were not very Christ-like. He killed people for bringing him bad news and things like that, you know. And we say, oh, how can this man be called perfect? He wasn't perfect in the sense that he was fully developed like Christ. Because even the Apostle Paul, who had far more light than David did, wasn't perfect in that sense. He was perfect in the sense that his heart was perfect or completely devoted to God. He was wholly devoted to God. And in his ignorance, there were times in which David did things that were not what we would call perfect, according to the light that we have. Yet his heart was perfect before the Lord. That's what God is calling on Abram to be, perfect before the Lord, to walk with a perfect heart. You know, to illustrate this, when Benjamin, my son, was learning to walk, he didn't walk very perfectly. He was not mature. He'd only take a few steps. And yet I was quite content. In fact, I was quite excited. You know, most parents are when they see their children take their first steps. It's an exciting thing. Because in your mind, that child is right where he ought to be. As far as you're concerned, that's perfect. He's right where you would expect him to be at this point. He's doing his best. But if he was walking the same way when he was 10 years old, we'd be concerned. Because a 10-year-old should walk better than a 1-year-old. And yet the 1-year-old who is walking imperfectly is yet perfect for a 1-year-old. You know, he's doing it just right, just the way a 1-year-old should do it, but not the way a 10-year-old should do it. And there's a sense in which we look forward to being just like Jesus and our walk to be just like his. And that'll be the ultimate perfection that we're looking forward to. But in the meantime, it is possible for us to be just what we ought to be at this point. God knows what we are and what we can be and what we cannot be, and he looks at our heart. And if our heart is totally devoted to him, that's all he requires. From the moment of our conversion to the moment of our resurrection, we can do no better than to have a perfect heart before God and to be totally devoted to the Lord. And if we are, whatever state we're at, regardless of our level of ignorance or our level of weakness or shortage of giftedness or whatever, we're perfect before God because we are just what we ought to be at that time. And that is, I believe, the sense in which God was calling Abram to become perfect. And Jesus said, be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Certainly perfection is desirable and is possible. But I don't believe necessarily in a perfection that we reach in this life that we become incapable of sin. I believe the resurrection of the body is that which makes that perfection possible. Verse 2 says, and I will make my covenant between me and thee, and I will multiply thee exceedingly. And Abram fell on his face to worship, and God talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. That's not necessarily news. I mean, that's already been said before. However, it says, neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, which means exalted father. But thy name shall be Abraham. Not much difference, adding only one syllable, and yet Abraham means father of a multitude. And he therefore was supposed to start calling himself now father of a multitude. Well, he only had one son. He was not the father of a multitude. But God said, from now on, call yourself that. Why? Because I've just told you you're going to be the father of many nations. Now, you don't see it yet, but I've already said it's true. And if I said it, it's real. It's genuine. You can start talking like it's already there. You start calling yourself father of a multitude now, even though you have only one child. Because you can speak the same things God speaks. This is the valid positive confession teaching of the Scripture. God, it says in Romans 4, calls those things which are not as though they were. In fact, it's talking about this very verse. It's talking about this very passage in Romans 4 when he says that. God was talking to Abram and said, call yourself father of a multitude, even though he wasn't the father of a multitude. And it says of this in Romans chapter 4, as it is written, I have made thee a father of many nations, beginning at verse 17 of Romans 4. Before him whom he believed, even God, who quickens the dead and calls those things which be not as though they were, who against hope believed in hope, that he might become the father of many nations, according to that which was spoken, so shall thy seed be. In other words, there was no hope in the flesh. Abram was now too old for this. And he couldn't have any more children. But God said, you're going to be the father of a multitude. Therefore, start talking like you are. Now, that was an act of faith for Abram to call himself that, because all the Semitic peoples that he would meet, in knowing that his name was Abram, would recognize the meaning of that name means father of a multitude. And it would be of great embarrassment to him, if he didn't really believe God, to tell people, introduce himself as the father of a multitude when he really was pretty nearly childless. And yet it was a matter of faith, because God said it. He was going to speak the same way God was. And so he was going to accept that by faith before he really realized it. Because he had a genuine promise from God, and we can rest in the promises of God to that extent that we begin to speak of them as realities. For instance, the Bible says that we are called saints. Do you know what saint means? Holy ones. Are you holy? Well, partly. But when you call yourself a saint, it's a matter of faith, really. And because God calls us holy ones, or saints, because that's what he's going to make us into. He told Abram, you call yourself Abraham, father of multitude, because that's what I'm going to make you into. But you call yourself that before you're there, because the fact that I've determined that that's what you're going to be makes it a certainty. The determination of God in the matter makes it a certainty that's as solid as if it has already been fulfilled in history, because God's determination is irrevocable in the matter. So you can think of it as an eternal reality from this point forward. And later you'll see it manifest in history. Remember when Jesus met Peter, he called him a rock. He said, I'm going to change your name to Cephas, a rock. And yet Peter doesn't appear to be really a rock. He seems to be unstable in many respects during the gospel story, but he does become a rock in the book of Acts. And it does seem like Jesus often and God in the Old Testament would cause people to call themselves by a new name, signifying a new destiny or an appreciation for their destiny, and to accept by faith that destined reality that has not yet been realized in experience. So he says, start calling yourself Abraham. He says, and I will make thee exceeding full, and I will make nations out of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. Now he says, and I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee, and their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee and to thy seed forever. Again, the seed is Christ. And I will give unto thee, and to thy seed after thee, the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. And God said unto Abraham, thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore, thou and thy seed after thee in their generations. This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised. This is the first time this is commanded. And ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant between me and you. And he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man-child in your generations, he that is born in the house or bought with money of any stranger, and that is not even of your seed. All the servants included then. He that is born in thy house, and he that is bought with thy money, must needs be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And the uncircumcised man-child whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, the soul that shall be cut off from his people, for he has broken my covenant. Now, I've often asked myself, and I guess I may have asked the Lord, though I don't remember receiving a clear answer, why circumcision? You know, why this instead of something else? Why circumcision is the token of the covenant? And without being able to speak an oracular answer that I've received from God, I can give a number of considerations, all of which may play a part in God's reasoning. One is that later on, in Colossians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul speaks plainly about the circumcision of Christ that we have received. In Philippians 3:3, he speaks of the circumcision, we're the true circumcision who rejoice in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh. In a sense, what circumcision literally was cutting away flesh. Cutting away flesh. And Paul says, concerning the true circumcision of our hearts, in Philippians 3:3, we are those who put no confidence in the flesh. We cast the flesh away as any part of our hopes. Now, this is very significant to Jews because the Jews are the ones who circumcise themselves and for religious reasons. And they also are the ones who tend to put the most confidence in the flesh, in the sense of that Paul was speaking of. That is, in fleshly observance of rules and regulations, they put their confidence that they are right with God because they have a fleshly ancestry going back to Abram. They have fleshly genealogies that they feel give them a certain status. They, in the flesh, keep certain fleshly laws and ordinances, carnal ordinances, fleshly ordinances. Their whole relationship with God is of the flesh and not of the Spirit. And that's why Jesus had to say to them, the flesh doesn't profit anything. It's the Spirit that gives life. And the words I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life, in John 6:63. And so the flesh signifies trust in human effort, or in the flesh, sort of like what Abram had done by going into Hagar. And God says, now I want you to cut away the flesh. I want you to discard the flesh. Cast it from you. And put no confidence in the flesh. This act, this circumcision of the heart, where your heart ceases to lean upon the arm of flesh and starts to lean on God alone, this can be symbolized by an actual act of cutting away literal flesh as a symbolic gesture. But also, he said, it will be a mark. My covenant you will bear in your flesh as the result of this. That is, the Jews would have a fleshly mark on their bodies that would show that they were covenant people. And this has always been the mark of Judaism until recent times, where, at least in America, generally baby males are circumcised at birth for health reasons. But for centuries, of course, circumcision was the mark of being Jewish. In Nazi Germany, often if a person was suspected of being Jewish, he was forced to pull his pants down in public and show whether he was circumcised. That is because the mark of the covenant of God was in their flesh. In a sense, the covenant that we have with Jesus should be evident in our flesh, that is, in our bodies too. The Word should be made flesh in our lives, and our bodies and our actions, our visible outward life, should demonstrate that we are children of the covenant. His covenant should be in our flesh also, but we put no confidence in the flesh. We circumcise our hearts from any trust and leaning upon the arm of flesh, and we trust fully in the Spirit of God. We don't live our lives, in any sense, trusting that we in our own human effort can do anything. Paul said, I know that in me, that is in my flesh, there dwells no good thing. And so the cutting away of flesh is kind of a symbolic gesture. There may be more to it than that. The fact that it was an operation upon the organs that are used in procreation might even have some significance, suggesting that this is something that's passed down to your children too. He could have said, cut off your little finger if he wanted to, or the end of your nose, or there could have been some other mark that God told him to do as the mark of the covenant, but he had him cut the skin away from his sexual organ, which, of course, would mainly have the significance of being the means by which procreation is performed, and therefore suggesting that this is something that will touch your progeny as well, and not just something that you do, but this is a family thing. This is a family arrangement, and it is symbolized in these ways. There may be far more to it than that. I don't have time to speculate any further, but some of those may be the reason. If none of those things are the reason, then we could easily live with the fact that God has His reasons, and He doesn't need to even reveal what they are. But I believe there is symbolic value in it. And we know that in the New Testament, it was determined that Gentile converts do not have to be circumcised to be saved, because God is looking merely for true circumcision, which is of the heart and not of the flesh. That's stated in a number of places in the New Testament. Well, going on, it says, and God said to Abram, in verse 15, as for Sarai, thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah. The meaning of the name Sarai is disputed. No one's quite sure what it means, but Sarah means princess. And kind of interesting calling an 89-year-old woman princess. It's sort of the name that we give to a nickname to a little girl, more likely. But this old woman is now going to be called princess, and that's because she's going to become the matron of a great nation. She'll be like the queen or the princess of a great nation. By the way, there may be a suggestion here of the rejuvenating effect on her body that God is going to do in making her capable of bearing children, because later on we find that she was still a very attractive woman to the pagan king Abimelech, even at age 99. And there may have been some kind of supernatural rejuvenating process to restore her youth. It says in Psalm 103 that God satisfies your mouth with good things so that your youth is renewed like the eagles. what is that, verse 3 or so, verse 4, Psalm 103. It was believed that when an eagle would molt his feathers yearly, that he actually would be rejuvenated. With his new coat of feathers, he was a young eagle again. And that is at least poetically said to be true. And when Psalm 103 says that God causes your youth to be renewed like the eagles, I can clearly say that I have known old people who, upon finding the Lord, have become very young again. Okay, thanks. That's verse 5, Psalm 103, verse 5. So, it is quite true that God does renew youth. In the case of Sarai and Abram even, it may be that he physically did so. Because at a certain point, in fact, when Isaac was conceived, we are told in Hebrews that Abram's body was as good as dead for bearing children. Yet later, we're told, after Sarai died, that Abram took another wife, Keturah, and had 6 more kids. How'd that happen? Well, it may be, one of the answers may be, that God not only worked a special miracle to make them have this one child, Isaac, but did a lasting work in their bodies that renewed their youth. In order that they could see, because to conceive would not be the only miracle required. For a woman that age with brittle bones and sagging flesh and skin that was no longer elastic to actually carry a baby and so forth without being damaged by it, this would require more than just the miracle of conception. It would perhaps require rejuvenating of other parts of her body as well in order to make that a comfortable and safe process, I would think. Okay. I know of some couples who were barren, and after praying, the Lord made them fruitful, and they had many children, or several. Amen. Now here's the interesting thing. He says, change her name to Sarah. Then he said this in verse 16, I will bless her and give thee a son also of her. Now this shocked Abram when he heard that, because it never occurred to him at this point that Sarah was going to have a child. I mean, if it had ever occurred to him 13 years earlier before Ishmael was born, ever since Ishmael was born, it seemed totally unnecessary for Sarah to have a child. And as the 13 years had passed and Abram and Sarah had gotten so much older, it seemed even more impossible than ever. So the thought of Sarah having a child just did not cross his mind for those 13 years, that God was not speaking to him while Ishmael was growing up. But God says, I will bless her, and you'll have a son by her also, and I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations, and kings of peoples shall be of her. And it says, Abram fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old, and shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear? Did I say she was 99? I'm sorry, it was Abram who was 99. Sarah was only 90, or 89 at this point. 90 when she had the child. And Abram said unto God, oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. In other words, God, don't go to any trouble. Now, this is totally unnecessary. I mean, it's almost ridiculous. It's ludicrous. He laughed at the thought. Now, some people have tried to justify Abram this. He wasn't laughing out of doubt. He was laughing out of just mere joy. However, it sounds to me like he was laughing out of doubt, to tell you the truth. It seemed ludicrous. Now, I mean, maybe he was laughing out of mere joy, but the way he worded it just sounds to me like he had his doubts at this point. However, God removed those doubts. In the next chapter, when it was announced to Sarah herself that she'd have a son, she laughed too. And it's very clear that she was doubting at that point. She was embarrassed because God called her on the carpet and said, why are you laughing? Is anything too hard for Jehovah? And she said, I didn't laugh. But he said, yes, you did. And that ended the conversation. But it's interesting that both Abram and Sarah laughed. She clearly laughed out of disbelief. Many times people want to justify Abram and say, well, he was just laughing out of joy and not unbelief. It sounds to me like he had some problems in the terms of credulity of the matter too, or credibility of it. And he said, God, listen, we already got this 13-year-old boy. He's stalwart, he's youthful, he's strong, he's very promising. Besides, I worked this out 13 years ago. You don't have to worry about stepping in now. You know, I mean, we've done a pretty good job here. Why don't you just take this boy? Let Ishmael live before you. And God said, no, that's not really what's going to happen. He said to Abram, and God said, Sarah, thy wife, shall bear thee a son, indeed. And thou shalt call his name Isaac. Now, Isaac means laughter. And once again, just as God had a reason for Ishmael being named God hears, and that was the name of the son was actually to be a ministry, a continuing ministry to his mother. Here also the name Isaac, which means laughter, was to be a continuing ministry to Abram and Sarah, because both of them laughed when they heard about it. And they laughed because it seemed so impossible. And yet, when this child would be born, and they would daily have to call him by name, they'd be calling him laughter, laughter, and it would constantly remind them they laughed. And yet, though they laughed at the promise of God, here was the fulfillment of it right before them. The very fact that they were speaking his name showed that the promise of God, though it seemed ludicrous, came true. And it would remind them constantly that which seems most impossible, that seems almost ridiculous to suggest that God has promised will come to pass. And they would have him living before them in flesh and blood, constantly reminding them of that fact. And so God says, call him laughter. And call him Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed forever. But he says, as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. That is, Abraham did say, let Ishmael live before you forever. Okay, well, I've heard you. Behold, I have